U.S. presidents who were completely anti-LGBTQ. Part 2. If you are brand new to our channel, we invite you to take a moment to subscribe. Just click on the lit red button as well as the gray bell. Why the bell? Well, it will let you know every time we post a new video. 9. Warren G. Harding. At the time of his death, Warren G. Harding was one of the most beloved presidents by the American public, but it turns out he was just good at covering up scandal. After he passed on, Harding's many illicit affairs were made public, and his reputation will be forever tarnished. Of his most gossiped about scandals was Teapot Dome, in which government officials were accepting bribes for competitive oil rates. This was the biggest scandal in America before Watergate with Richard Nixon. It was at the 50-year celebration of the founding of Alabama that Harding spoke in front of 100,000 white and African American citizens. It was also the first and last time that he would mention civil rights as an issue. Although previously speaking out against public lynching, Harding received absolute silence after referencing that African Americans should be allowed to vote, and dropped the issue until his death. 10. Gerald Ford. This is a president that gained steam for the feminist movement in a time that being pro-choice or pro-women's equality wasn't that popular with the status quo. Gerald Ford served the United States as the 38th president during the mid to late 70s. The politician served as vice president under Richard Nixon until the disgraced president resigned in 1974, leaving Ford to serve in his place. He was a controversial president that pardoned Richard Nixon despite his Watergate scandal, and an outcry from the American people. He also declared the Vietnam War over, and helped release the tension of the Cold War by signing the Helsinki Accords. Ford was a major proponent of women's rights, declaring August 26 Women's Rights Day, and supporting the Equal Rights Amendment. He fought for each state to regulate their own abortion laws, and came out as pro-choice after his run as president. Although he was so for women's rights, when asked about gay rights, Ford would not respond. He admitted there was an issue with LGBTQ rights in the country, but wouldn't go any farther on the subject, making him neutral, and therefore a negative influence on LGBTQ rights in general. 11. Herbert Hoover. The 31st President of the United States was very focused on ending poverty, which was a very relevant domestic stance to take only 3 months before the great stock market crash of 1929. Despite this immediate blow to his presidential reputation, Hoover jumped right on planning regulations over the economic system so that the country could recover from what would eventually turn into the Great Depression. He also focused much of his political energy on foreign relations by pulling military and influence out of Latin American countries and mediating between Tonga and Africa. One thing that Hoover didn't invest political energies into was civil rights, although he made certain comments that if the African community could educate themselves, then they could get a rightful place in society. Our guess is that he didn't mention civil rights much, because he had somewhat racist views on the matter, leading us to believe that he'd be close-minded about LGBTQ rights as well. 12. Woodrow Wilson. Born as Thomas Woodrow Wilson, this politician and academic served as the 28th President of the United States and passed some laws that devastatingly punished a homosexual lifestyle, specifically in the armed forces. Before being elected in 1913, Wilson served as governor of New Jersey, where he cleaned up the power, corruption and economic issues that were plaguing the state. It was when Wilson was entering his second term when he started to sign bills into law that persecuted the LGBTQ lifestyle. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson signed the Immigration Act of 1917 that barred individuals deemed mentally defective or those who displayed a constitutional psychopathic inferiority from entering the United States. both of which were medical terms for homosexuality at the time. Aside from this law, Wilson also made assault with intent to commit sodomy, and sodomy itself as crimes in the Army that were punishable by court-martial. All of these laws persecuted the lives of LGBTQ, and Wilson is spot on this despicable list. 13. Andrew Johnson. This president was only made the 17th president of the United States because he was the vice president when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Andrew Johnson was also the very first president to be impeached, after which he was acquitted by the Senate. He was a Southern Unionist and was the only serving senator from a Confederate state that didn't secede from his seat. This made him an obvious running mate for Lincoln in the election for the 16th president. Although he didn't secede with the Confederates, Johnson was against most amendments and laws that gave rights to African Americans and former slaves. Many rank him among the very worst presidents that have served office. With this information about how racist Johnson is, we gather that, if gay humans were allowed to be out in this time period, that Andrew Johnson would surely fight their ability to have equal rights. 14. James A. Garfield. The 20th President of the United States was first elected to the Senate until he was eventually elected President. His run in office was the shortest ever as the dark horse Republican candidate that was assassinated only 3 months into his presidential run. Garfield was a major general in the Union Army and was very against the Confederate secession. He was a mover and a shaker in his short time spent as president, and took on some very heavy hitters in the U.S. His main focus in his very short presidency was on removing corruption from the U.S. Postal Service and control of senatorial power. It was probably this focus that garnered him enough attention to be assassinated in the first place. With his rigid stance on most issues, leads us to believe that he would be against LGBTQ rights if given the chance, but we are just guessing with this one. 15. Barack Obama. Alright, we agree this one is a bit of a stretch. But in California, the election of Barack Obama actually has been said to have solidified the anti-American and anti-LGBTQ Prop 8 passing. This is because the ability to vote for an African-American president drew out a lot of African-American voters who otherwise might not have casted their ballot. The African-American community is commonly anti-LGBTQ, which is why more African-American voters meant less rights for gays that year. Obama also did some great work for LGBTQ rights in his last year as president, but up until then he hadn't worked as much of an advocate for the community. Although the first 7 years didn't give the LGBTQ community much change, at least gay marriage has been legalized, and military rule don't ask, don't tell has been repealed. We put Obama on this list begrudgingly, because in the long run he hasn't been completely anti-LGBTQ.